New York has always had its fair share of problems, but in the 19th century, it had something that made Gotham look like a paradise. 5 points. Oh, 5 points. This neighborhood was so chaotic that even Hollywood had to tone it down in Gangs of New York, 2002. Seriously, the movie is amazing, but if you think they exaggerated things a bit, that's because you haven't heard the real details of this urban jungle. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Was 5 Points truly the worst place to live in US history? Today, we're taking a time travel trip to uncover the truth behind this infamous neighborhood, packed with gangs, corruption, and, well, a stench that would make anyone think twice before calling it home. To make things even more interesting, let's compare 5 Points to other legendary crime hubs, like Gotham from Batman, Arkham City, or the gang-infested streets of Assassin's Creed, Syndicate's London, where the law was more of a suggestion than a real thing. So, buckle up, because this story is going to feel like an action movie, full of plot twists, chaos, and, of course, a good dose of sarcasm and humor. Let's find out if 5 Points truly deserved its reputation as the most dangerous neighborhood ever, or if that's just an urban legend. Ready to dive into 5 Points? Let's do this! Hey Discovers, real quick before we dive back in, I've got a small favor to ask. If you love historical curiosities, epic battles, crazy mysteries, and mind-blowing stories that most people don't know about, then hit that subscribe button right now. That way, you won't miss any of our new videos and can keep uncovering insane facts every week. And of course, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and brings you even more awesome content. Alright, let's jump back into history. So, how did a place so iconically chaotic and crime-ridden come to exist? If you thought any neighborhood could magically turn into a disaster zone, I hate to break it to you, it wasn't magic. It was an engineering disaster. See, 5 Points was built on what used to be a lake, the Collect Pond, which was filled in without any proper drainage. Now, think of the worst possible type of ground to build a neighborhood on. Swampy, muddy, sinking into the earth. It was so unstable that houses were literally sinking into the ground. Picture this. You buy a house, step inside, and boom, it starts sinking, with water rising to your knees. And worse than that, the smell. The neighborhood reeked so badly that, honestly, you'd probably prefer living in a porta-potty at Coachella. But of course, city planning in the 1800s didn't exactly prioritize logic, so no one really stopped to think that maybe basic drainage would have been a good idea. The only thing worse than this engineering fail was trying to build a sandcastle during high tide. And that was just the beginning of 5 Points problems. Now, if you thought the swampy terrain was bad, wait till you hear what happened next. In the 1840s, a massive wave of immigration hit New York. And when you combine a crumbling, unstable neighborhood with an exploding population, the result is social chaos at its finest. 5 Points quickly became overcrowded, and not just a little overcrowded. We're talking 15 people crammed into tiny, single-room apartments. Oh, and don't forget the rats. Lots of them. Imagine, your 14 new roommates, a couple of rats, and zero personal space. No ventilation, no clean water, and medical care? Yeah, not a thing. The living conditions were straight out of a horror movie mixed with a survival documentary. Now, if you've ever had a moment where you thought, I can't take this anymore, imagine feeling that every single day. The overcrowding of Irish families and newly freed black citizens after slavery created insane social tension. And besides the lack of food and decent housing, there were zero job opportunities. And when there's no work, crime moves in like an uninvited guest. Then, of course, there was political corruption. Because what's a lawless hellscape without a little government-backed crime? The Tammany Hall political machine didn't care about fixing 5 Points, they cared about votes. And how did they secure them? By using gangs to control and manipulate the population. That's right, the gangs weren't just running wild. They were basically hired muscle for politicians. Imagine yourself in 5 Points, an area where local gangs are literally in charge. Crime is rampant, and sorrow is all around. You were better off approaching a gangster than a police officer if you needed anything, from a government position to simple protection. Why? Because the police officers were either too afraid to act or accepted bribes. Recall that inadequate infrastructure, poverty, immigration, and a lack of employment prospects had already endangered 5 Points. This wasn't just the most dangerous neighborhood, it was a blueprint for organized crime. And guess who came out of 5 Points to become a crime legend? That's right, some of the biggest mobsters in history. Now, if you think gangs back then were just a bunch of thugs running around aimlessly, you're in for a surprise. 5 Points wasn't just a bad neighborhood, it was a battlefield for some of the most notorious gangs in US history. And when I say battlefield, I mean it literally. If you've seen Gangs of New York, 2002, you know the violence between these gangs was next level. But the movie barely scratched the surface. Some of the most infamous gangs were the Dead Rabbits, a fierce Irish Catholic gang that didn't just fight for money. They were basically a resistance movement against nativist Protestants. These guys were brutal. The Bowery Boys, a rival gang of nativist Protestants who wanted Irish immigrants gone. Their fights with the Dead Rabbits were less about crime and more about identity. The 5 Points Gang, the real masterminds of crime. This gang wasn't just about street fights, they were the foundation of organized crime. This gang was where the mafia was born. We're talking about guys like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, who started their criminal careers right here. These weren't just street brawlers, they were entrepreneurs of crime. They turned 5 Points into a training ground for the mob, laying the foundation for the mafia's rise in America. So, next time you watch a gangster movie and wonder, how did all this start? Just remember, it all began in 5 Points, where gangs weren't just fighting for turf, they were building the future of organized crime. Alright, let's tackle a big question. Was 5 Points actually the worst neighborhood of all time? Or did it just get famous because of urban legends, wild stories, and its chaotic reputation? To find out, we're gonna compare 5 Points to other infamous, crime-ridden areas throughout history. And heads up, some of these places were seriously brutal. 5 Points versus Whitechapel, London, Jack the Ripper's playground. First, let's hop across the Atlantic to London, where crime had a different style, but was just as deadly. Whitechapel was as infamous as 5 Points, but for a different reason. It had one serial killer that terrorized an entire city. In 1888, Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of Whitechapel, leaving behind a trail of gruesome murders. This wasn't gang violence like in 5 Points. This was pure psychological horror. People in Whitechapel weren't dodging street fights. They were living in fear of an unknown killer, never knowing who was next. So which was worse? 5 Points was chaotic and full of violent gangs, but Whitechapel had the paranoia factor. In 5 Points, you had to choose a side or risk getting jumped. In Whitechapel, you could be doing nothing at all and still end up a victim. 5 Points versus 1920s Chicago, the reign of Al Capone. Fast forward a few decades to Prohibition-era Chicago, where crime went from street brawls to highly organized business operations. And if you think of gangsters, you probably think of one name: Al Capone. During the 1920s, Chicago became the center of organized crime in America. Gangsters weren't just robbing people in back alleys. They controlled the illegal alcohol trade, bribed politicians, and ran the city from the shadows. And then there was the Valentine's Day Massacre, 1929. A brutal public execution of rival gang members, carried out with military precision. Unlike 5 Points, where crime was disorganized and reckless, Chicago's gangsters had money, power, and influence at every level of society. So which was worse? 5 Points was lawless and chaotic, but Chicago was cold, calculated, and far deadlier. While 5 Points was the birthplace of street gangs, Chicago perfected organized crime on a national scale. 5 Points versus Modern Cartel territories. A whole new level of violence. Now, let's jump to the present day, because if you think 19th century gang violence was bad, wait until you hear about modern cartel-run cities. Forget fistfights and knife duels. The Mexican cartels operate with military-grade weapons, armored vehicles, and billions in drug money. Places like Ciudad Juarez and Sinaloa are war zones, where cartels run entire regions, bribe officials, and execute mass killings on a regular basis. The difference: 5 Points had crime, but it was still under some form of government control. In cartel territories, the cartels are the government. Kidnappings, mass executions, and brutal displays of power make 5 Points look like a schoolyard fight. So was 5 points the worst? Not even close. It was bad for its time, but in today's world, cartel-controlled areas make it look like child's play. So, after all that, was 5 points the worst place to ever exist? Well, it depends on how you define worst. Yes, it was one of the most chaotic neighborhoods in American history. Yes, it was an early breeding ground for organized crime. Yes, it was filthy, overcrowded, and violent. But was it the most dangerous place ever? Not even close. In places like 1920 Chicago, crime became highly organized and far more deadly. And in modern cartel zones, crime is at a level that 5 points could never even dream of reaching. So why do we still talk about 5 points? Because it was the blueprint. It was where street gangs evolved into powerful criminal enterprises. It was where corrupt politicians and police officers learned how to profit from crime. Without 5 points, New York's criminal underworld, and maybe even the entire American mafia, might have looked very different. So, what did we learn today? 5 points wasn't the deadliest, but it was one of the most influential. And in the world of crime, influence is just as important as body count.